Hey up! Right, I didn't get a chance to film the front and rear suspension upgrade on the Continental GT. I know these videos are only 15 or 20 minutes long, but just filming the rear end took 4 or 5 hours, plus the test on top of that, and a little bit of location filming, altogether 6 or 7 hours. But rest assured, I will get onto the front end ASAP. Now, branding. I'm always getting complaints from people that don't like manufacturers putting their trademark or whatever where it can be seen on a product. Manufacturers started doing this about 200 years ago. I'm not really sure why it's suddenly become an issue with people, with some people claiming that the manufacturers should be paying them to advertise their name. Now, going on the number of people that are liable to actually pay attention to your bike during its lifetime, and comparing it to the ad revenue that I actually earn from these videos that I make, I reckon that during the lifetime of your bike you would probably earn about half a penny per item. I mean, that could add up to a whopping, maybe 10 pence if you buy a lot of parts. Now, you see, I see branding in a different light. I see it as a statement to onlookers that you've given careful consideration to your purchase, that you care about your bike, and that you're prepared to invest in quality. And to be quite honest, I'm a bit suspicious of any company that's not got the confidence to put its name on a product. Now, having said that, when I fitted the YSS piggyback shocks to the Interceptor a couple of years back, a lot of people complained that they didn't like the YSS branding, that it wasn't in keeping with the bike, which is a different thing. And they asked if it was possible to fit the shocks in a way that the YSS branding wouldn't be visible. So on this occasion, and this occasion only, just to please those people, I have sort of fitted these shocks in stealth mode to demonstrate that it is perfectly possible. Although, full disclosure, I will be swapping them back again as soon as I get a chance. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about is setting the sag. I get a lot of requests about this. There is a lot of internet advice on how to do this, and the parameters given vary. You know, there are slightly different opinions on what the sag should be, and a lot of people get very frustrated because no matter what instructions they follow and how hard they try, they simply cannot achieve the sag measurements that they're told they need to set. And I'll try my best to give some pragmatic advice on this subject at the end of this video after installation. I have to admit, I thought I knew exactly what to expect with these shocks, but setup actually turned out to be much easier straight out of the box than the piggyback version. And granted, the weight distribution on the Continental GT is very different to that of the Interceptor, but I also found that they give a more comfortable ride without compromising the handling. Now, as it turns out, these shocks are adjustable for preload and rebound damping only, not compression damping. Compression damping has, in my opinion, been very skillfully set at the factory. So you only need to worry about the preload adjustment and, of course, the rebound damping. Now, this is a bit of a strange configuration. I've not personally come across this before with any shock. I'm not saying that it's not been done before, it's just that I personally haven't encountered it. With most shocks, you will find that you have, obviously, preload adjustment, and if it's a higher grade shock, you will also have damping adjustment for compression, with rebound damping being left off the list, unless it's a very high spec shock, and then you will have all three. Now, shortly after fitting, when it came to setup and I realised that there was no compression damping adjustment, I was disappointed. And initially it did knock my perception of the value for money aspect of these items. But once I actually got out on the open road and had a chance to twiddle a few knobs, this configuration converted me. YSS have got the compression damping absolutely spot on. I carried out a few circuits of what constitutes my normal suspension setup proving ground, which to be honest is mainly pretty crappy, unclassified farm roads. It's a sort of a mixture of average tarmac and then some really nasty, neglected sections of road full of potholes and cracks, damage caused by farm machinery. And I've always found that if I can set a suspension system up to cope with that in a way that I'm happy with, it's usually spot on for general use anywhere. Now, obviously, these Z-Series YSS shock absorbers are suitable for the Royal Enfield Continental GT 650 and the Interceptor 650. Now, in the case of the Interceptor, you're going to have a centre stand, which is going to make things much easier. If you have the Continental GT, unless you've fitted the aftermarket centre stand, you're going to need to find a way of getting the back wheel up off the ground. And a bike jack is the safest solution for this. A paddock stand is no good because you're going to be putting the weight on the shocks still, so I'll leave you to work out how you're going to do that. The most important thing to remember is that it needs to be stable. The last thing you want is your bike falling over or falling onto you while you're working on it. Now, these Z-Series shocks come in the same packaging as the piggyback shocks. And in fact, they contain the same instruction booklet relating to the piggyback shocks. But the adjustment facilities on these shocks are exactly the same as the adjustment facilities in the booklet. You just don't have the compression damping adjustment. These shocks do work primarily through oil emulsion damping. So if you intend fitting these to the bike and then immediately taking the bike out for a run and setting them up, I would advise you to unpack them and make sure that they're repacked with both shocks positioned the correct way up, preferably the night before you decide to fit them. Now, the reason for this is that these shocks are usually packed alternately, i.e. one will be upside down and one will be the right way up. And then on top of that, it's been in storage laid on its side. So the oil that you require for the damping is going to be everywhere inside that shock body except on the bottom of the shock body where it needs to be. Don't worry if you forget to do this, but what I would say is do not attempt to set these shocks up once you've fitted them to your bike for at least 4 hours to allow the oil to drip down and find its way into the bottom of the shock body where it needs to be. Otherwise, these shocks are not going to function correctly, and when it comes to the adjustment process, you're just going to be whistling into the wind. These shocks are adjustable for length very slightly, a total of about 10mm, and they do come from the factory about 5mm longer than the standard OEM shocks. Unless you are vertically challenged, I would advise you leave them where they are. If you want to shorten them so that they are the exact same length as the OEM shocks, you're going to need two oversized open-ended spanners to facilitate that. So bear that in mind before purchase. Now, in the greater scheme of things, this extra 5mm doesn't really amount to anything. But I have a feeling that YSS have set them like this for a reason. It does alter your steering geometry very, very slightly. And in my opinion, it improves handling. It's subtle, but it is there, and other people have commented about it to me as well, so I know it's not just me. Again, this is an area that I will leave to your discretion. Now, obviously, the first thing you're going to need to do before you can fit these shocks is remove the old shocks. You should only do one at a time, and I would advise that you start on the left-hand side of the bike. I'll explain the reasons for that later on. Now, in order to get the bottom shock mounting bolt out, you need to loosen your exhaust off so you can just pull it to one side slightly. You don't have to remove it, just loosen it off. So slacken off the bolt just underneath the engine casing and remove the nut from the bracket just behind the passenger foot peg. Don't remove the bolt that holds it in place because you need to leave the exhaust hanging on it, but you need the free play to be able to get the bottom mounting bolt out. Then you can go ahead and remove the bottom mounting bolt. Now, Royal Enfield seem to use even more Loctite than Triumph do. So be warned, the first time you remove these, it's going to require some real brute strength. Don't worry, this is perfectly normal. You've just got to break the seal on the Loctite. And I don't know what Loctite they've used, but it's like concrete. Once you've got that done, just pull your exhaust system back out of the way and remove the bolt. You can then turn your attention to the top shock bolt. Now, these are equally as difficult to get off, again due to an overabundance of Loctite, and these top shock mounting bolts, I have to say, are quite soft metal. I know by the second time I'd sort of made some modifications to the Interceptor 650, they pretty much had it. But there are solutions to this both from Motorn Customs and Hitchcock's Motorcycles, and I'll show you one of those in a moment. Right, once you've followed these steps, you're free to remove your old shock, and it's as simple as that. Now for the fun bit. Now, these YSS shocks come complete with all bushings. There's no need to transfer any parts over from your old shocks. You can, if you like, smear a little grease on the inside of the bushings to facilitate fitting, but it's not, strictly speaking, necessary. First of all, make sure that you place the bottom part of the shock into the shock receiving shoe or bracket. Don't worry about lining the holes up at this stage, you just need to make sure that it is actually sitting in that bracket, because once you fit the top eyelet onto the mounting post, there's not going to be enough movement to fit it in afterwards. Once you've got the shock inserted onto that top post, you can then return to the bottom to see about lining it up. Now, it's important that you only do one shock at a time, but having said that, I've never come across a shock fitting situation where the shock that I'm fitting is exactly the same length as the shock that I've removed. There's always a slight disparity. And of course we know that in this case there's a 5mm difference. This means that your bottom hole isn't going to line up without a bit of persuasion, so you won't be able to get the bolt through. The solution to this is a fairly strong screwdriver with a rag or something wrapped around it so that you don't damage the paintwork on your swing arm or damage the bottom of the new shock. Place it in that space underneath the bottom of the shock and then just gently coax it into place as you push the shock mounting bolt through. Your shock is basically a spring, so all you're doing is compressing it slightly to even out the length so you can get it in. You can then go ahead and tighten it up. Now, this shock installation isn't complete until you've replaced the top bolt, and as I've said, the existing bolts are a little bit like chewing gum. Motorn Customs do have some suitable options, and I'll leave links for those, but also Hitchcock's Motorcycles have had these stainless steel versions made up. From a distance they look very similar to the OEM shock mounting bolts, but close up they are of far higher quality. They're made from stainless steel and they're much better finished. They also have a slightly longer thread and a deeper slot for your Allen key, so they're less likely to chew up. Or obviously, if you manage to get the OEM ones off without causing any damage to them, just reuse those. Now, don't forget to tighten up your exhaust fasteners again, and once you've done that, that's that side finished. Now, the reason I say only to do one side at a time is that your rear wheel assembly and your swing arm is extremely heavy, and once both shocks are removed, your back wheel is just going to want to drop to the ground, and if you're on your own, good luck getting it all back in place again. In fact, believe me, you will struggle even if there's two of you. Now, the reason I recommended that you start on the left-hand side is because with these shocks being very slightly longer and you're having to sort of lever the eyelets to get the bottom shock mount bolt to line up, you don't want to be carrying out that procedure on the other side because some of your brake hoses use that space underneath the bottom shock mount. Now, once you've got the left-hand shock installed and your right-hand shock removed ready for the new shock, you will have effectively reset the distance from the top shock mount bolt to the bottom one, so there'll be no need to go through that levering procedure, it will just go straight in. A word of caution though, I would just make sure before commencing fitting that you check both of your new shocks are exactly the same length. As I've said, they are precisely set at the factory, but you never know. Once again, don't forget to fasten all your exhaust brackets back up once you've finished this procedure, and then that's the installation done. Now, before we go any further, you must ensure that your tyres are inflated to the specifications dictated by your manufacturer. There's no point trying to set your suspension up with over or under inflated tyres. And having said that, I suppose the first thing that we need to do is discuss this concept of setting the sag. And the sag is basically the amount of suspension travel that is taken up by the weight of the bike and the rider. The sag is basically predetermined by the amount of spring load you have on the shocks at the time. The less preload you have, theoretically, the more sag you will have. The more preload that you have, theoretically, the less sag you will have. Now, the whole concept of sag adjustment was created by suspension tuning experts for use in competition, and as often happens, this has been sort of absorbed or integrated into general motorcycling use. But I have a number of problems with that concept for the likes of you or I. For a start, this concept takes it for granted that the strength of the springs have been matched to the weight of the rider. Now, that's all very well if you're of average weight, the weight usually taken into account by most spring manufacturers when they manufacture an off-the-shelf shock absorber. But if you're a lightweight or you're heavy boned, you're going to find it absolutely impossible to set up what is known as dynamic sag, and that's the sag dictated by the weight of the rider sitting on the bike. And that's going to be about 40 or 50% of the motorcycle riding population. In which case you're going to have springs custom made to suit your weight, which isn't an option for most people, and it's certainly going to limit your choice of shock absorbers. And even then, you're possibly going to run into problems. Now, this whole concept just takes into account the weight of one rider. Now, that's all well and good if you set up your dynamic sag with your bike with a full tank of fuel, and you can get all the parameters and measurements that have been dictated to you in a row, you're good to go, right? Now, any motorcyclist knows that when he pulls into a garage forecourt with an empty tank and fills his tank up, even a relatively small tank of, let's say, 13 litres, you're instantly adding 13 kilograms onto the weight of your bike. And we all know how the riding dynamics of a bike change when you fill an empty tank up and ride away on it. Now, the problem is, as long as you're riding that bike, you're gradually emptying that tank, so those dynamics are changing minute by minute. And so are those millimetre precise sag measurements that you've set your suspension to. And that is before we even deal with the problems that you're then going to encounter when you carry some luggage or a passenger or both. All that hard work and precise measurement goes straight out of the window. And of course, we can't keep repeating this laborious process several times a day to keep everything in trim where the experts tell us that it should be. Now, just to make it even more scientifically correct, a lot of these experts will tell you to wear your normal riding gear, while you set these sag measurements. Well, what's your normal riding gear? Because you're probably going to wear heavier clothing during winter to that you'd wear in the summer. And as we all know, you can't measure it that critically because the human body normally fluctuates in weight from day to day. Just eating a salty meal can add up to 1 kilogram onto your body weight. And 2 cups of coffee at your local biker cafe will add over a pound. So just how relevant is this concept for your average guy on the street that likes to ride a bike on a weekend? My argument is not very relevant at all. Now, you can argue that I'm wrong until you're blue in the face, and I won't take any notice. I've been riding bikes 40 years, and I've found that this is very much the case. The best you can do is set up the static sag on your bike. That is, with the bike up on a jack or on a centre stand with the weight taken off the wheel in question, measure the available suspension travel. In the case of my bike with these Z series shocks, it was 72 millimeters, and that's the distance between the piston and the bump stop. Then allow the weight of the bike to come down onto those shocks and compress them. As a general rule of thumb, with the correct spring preload, it should take up about 10 to 15 millimeters of that available suspension travel. And ideally this should be at minimum or near to minimum spring preload. And that should be the case if the springs have been created specifically for that model of bike. Now, this will very likely change over the next few thousand miles because when springs are new, they're very stiff and they relax over time with use. So recheck this about every 1,000 miles from the first time that you've done it. Now, these YSS shocks have probably one of the best micro adjustable spring preload systems in the business. It's a threaded collar which when turned to the right will slacken the preload, and when turned to the left will increase preload. As you can see here, I was slackening it to achieve the best static sag. I would advise that you use a ruler to measure the distances between the top of the adjuster and the collar itself to ensure that you get it exactly even on both sides. I found with these I had to sort of release it to about 3 millimeters distance in the end, so that is just about the lowest preload setting available in order to achieve about 10 millimeters of sag. And I left it at that, bearing in mind that my fuel tank was actually almost empty. And remember, this is static sag that we're talking about. That is just the weight of the motorcycle on the shocks, nothing else. And from there, adjust your damping to suit. Now, as I said earlier on, YSS have expertly, in my opinion, set up the compression damping with these shocks, which really takes a lot of the guesswork out of it for you. The roads that I ride on are pretty rough, and in the end I ended up clicking the rebound damping up from its lowest setting by 8 clicks. Now, the instructions are a little bit misleading because they describe the rebound damping as soft and hard. What it actually means is the soft setting means that you've got very little rebound damping, so the spring is allowed to return back to its full length at its own pace, more or less. There's very little there to stop it from returning. On the hard setting, it slows that spring recovery down. Now, that's fine on really, really smooth roads, but if you're on bumpy roads like the ones I ride on, could mean that the spring won't recover sufficiently before it hits the next bump, and the bike will probably start to bog down a little bit and you'll run out of suspension travel and you'll start to encounter the suspension bottoming out because the springs are just not recovering in time for the road surface. Now, 8 clicks up from the minimum setting suit me just fine. It was a nice smooth ride. The back end wasn't flapping about, but I could feel that the suspension was working. This isn't necessarily going to suit you, this is just what suits me. Now, if you find that the shock absorbers just seem to be bouncing up and down, it means that you don't have enough rebound damping. You've got it set too soft and it needs to be increased. because it's rebounding too fast and needs to be slowed down a little. Now, I consider its setting here at minimum spring preload to be ideal, because that means that I have now got the full range of spring preload adjustment to cater for pillion passengers and or luggage. This suspension is going to cater for me for whatever I want to do. If you found that you're having to adjust your spring preload on any motorcycle to halfway just to get it to feel right for you as a single rider, you're going to run into issues with it if you want to do anything else with the bike. Now, I'm actually really impressed with these shocks. They give a really comfortable, competent ride even when you're going through the twists and turns on a bumpy road. They're ideal for somebody who wants to be able to customise the ride to some extent, but doesn't want to get too bogged down with the science of suspension adjustment. Perfect for your average rider, really. The quality of these shocks is the same as the piggyback shocks. It's second to none. They're excellent quality bits of kit. And the fact that YSS have expertly set up the compression damping but taken adjustability out of the equation, actually, for your average rider, is a big bonus. It's a really sensible concept that I just hadn't considered in the past. Right, that's enough from me this week. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. It really does help me out. I would also be very appreciative if you would take the time to leave a like and consider subscribing to this channel if you're not already a subscriber. I'm certainly not going to be getting my silver play button this year as I'd hoped, but well, who knows. I am of course going to be back next week, so until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.